The battlefield stretched endlessly, a wasteland of shattered banners and broken bodies. Smoke coiled into the air, blending with the dim light of a setting sun, casting the valley in an eerie, blood-streaked haze. Alden crouched low among the ruins of war, his breath shallow, his heart pounding like the hammer he once wielded in peace. He hadn't planned to come here. The stories of the slaughter had reached Alden Hollow, and while others turned away, Alden had come, searching for scraps of iron, weapons he could reforge. Yet now he was running, his hands no longer empty, but cradling the fragile form of a child, a boy whose piercing eyes mirrored both terror and defiance. The boy hadn't cried out when Alden found him beneath the wreckage of a cart, his small fingers clutching a medal that gleamed with an insignia Alden knew well. Royal blood, the crest of the kingdom's fallen line. A shout echoed in the distance, the guttural bark of soldiers combing the wreckage. Alden pressed himself against the base of a ruined siege engine, the boy trembling against his chest. He had no plan, no weapon beyond a rusted dagger, but he wouldn't abandon the child now. "Stay quiet," Alden whispered, his voice a gruff mix of command and reassurance. The boy nodded, his grip tightening on the metal, as if it were the last tether to a world that had betrayed him. The sound of boots drew closer, and Alden braced himself. If they were discovered, he would fight. For the first time in years, the blacksmith felt the fire of purpose reigniting within him, not for vengeance or glory, but for the fragile life he now carried. The valley was a place of death, but Alden had found something worth saving, something that would set him on a path he never imagined. That path began not with hope, but with survival, as the shadow of night fell over the battlefield. The village of Alden Hollow was nestled in the shadow of an ancient mountain range, its cobblestone streets lined with cottages whose thatched roofs sagged under the weight of time. In the heart of this modest settlement stood the forge, a place where fire never slept and iron sang under the relentless strikes of a hammer. This forge belonged to Alden, a blacksmith known as much for his quiet strength as for the masterpieces he crafted. Alden's hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with practiced precision as he shaped a blade on his anvil. Sparks danced around him, illuminating the streaks of gray that marbled his dark hair. Though his body bore the scars of battles fought long ago, his heart carried wounds far deeper, wounds that no fire or steel could mend. The war that had swept through their kingdom a decade earlier had left Alden bereft of family and filled his days with solitude. The villagers respected Alden, though he was a man of few words. Farmers brought him their broken plows, and guards trusted him with their swords. But no one truly knew the sorrow that lingered behind his eyes. Every evening, when the forge's flames dimmed, Alden would sit by the small graveyard at the edge of the village, staring at two unmarked stones. He rarely spoke of the wife and daughter he had lost to the war, but their absence echoed in every corner of his quiet life. It was late autumn when the winds brought troubling news to Alden Hollow. Travelers from the south spoke of a great defeat suffered by the king's army at the hands of the usurper, Lord Draven. Whispers of betrayal and bloodshed filled the air, and fear crept into the hearts of the villagers. Some spoke of fleeing north, while others fortified their homes in anticipation of the chaos that would surely follow. One evening, as Alden locked the forge for the night, a group of men gathered near the well in the village square. Their voices carried over the chilled air. "They say the king himself fell in battle," murmured one. "Without him, the kingdom is as good as lost," another replied, shaking his head. Alden paused, his grip tightening on the forge's door. He had heard enough. Kingdoms rose and fell, he thought bitterly. But for men like him, the tides of power only brought more suffering. Yet as he walked home, the unease in the village seemed to cling to him like a shadow. The following morning, Alden woke to a sky the color of ash. Driven by a restless need, he saddled his old mare and rode toward the valley where the king's army had made its last stand. He told no one of his plans, but he justified the journey to himself as practical. If the battlefield had been abandoned, there might be tools or materials he could salvage. Perhaps even armor he could repurpose for the village guards. As the path twisted through the dense forest, the stillness grew oppressive. No bird sang, and the only sound was the soft crunch of hooves on frostbitten leaves. When Alden emerged into the valley, the sight before him stole his breath. The ground was littered with the remains of a once proud army. Tattered banners fluttered weakly in the breeze, their royal insignias smeared with mud and blood. Broken swords and shattered shields glinted in the pale sunlight, a grim testament to the ferocity of the battle. And there among the wreckage lay the bodies, rows upon rows of fallen soldiers, their faces frozen in expressions of defiance or despair. Alden dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he began to search. He ignored the stench of death and the gnawing dread in his stomach, focusing instead on practicalities. But as the hours passed and the sun began its descent, something drew his attention, a faint sound, barely audible over the rustling leaves. He followed the noise, his heart pounding. It was a soft whimper, weak and uneven, coming from beneath a collapsed wagon. With a surge of strength, Alden heaved the debris aside, revealing a small figure curled among the ruins. It was a child, no older than 5 or 6, dressed in tattered finery that spoke of nobility. His face was streaked with dirt, and his hands clutched a small, ornate medal to his chest. When the boy looked up, his eyes, bright and piercing, met Alden's, and something unspoken passed between them. The blacksmith knelt, his voice gruff but gentle. "You're safe now," he said, lifting the boy into his arms. The medal the child clutched caught the fading sunlight, and Alden recognized the emblem, the crest of the royal family. For a moment, he stood frozen, the weight of the realization settling over him. This was no ordinary child. And with that understanding came a flood of questions and a single, unyielding thought. This boy's life was now in his hands. Alden carried the boy through the remnants of the battlefield, his steps heavy as the gravity of his discovery settled over him. The child's frail body shivered against the cold, and his small fingers clenched tightly around the medal, refusing to let go even as his strength faltered. The emblem of the royal family gleamed faintly in the dying light of the sun, its intricate design unmistakable, a crowned falcon, wings outstretched, clutching a sword. The boy's gaze darted around, wide with fear, and though his lips trembled as though to speak, no sound emerged. Alden understood the silence. The horrors of the battlefield had stolen the child's voice, if only temporarily. He pulled his thick cloak tighter around the boy, shielding him from the chill, and glanced at the darkening horizon. Night would fall soon, and the valley was no place for the living after dusk. The blacksmith's mind raced as he mounted his mare with the child cradled in one arm. There were too many questions and no answers in sight. How had the boy survived this massacre? Why had no one come for him? Alden's eyes returned to the medal. If this child was indeed of royal blood, then his presence here was no accident. He was a target, and by taking him, Alden knew he might have just painted a target on his own back as well. As they rode back through the forest, shadows stretched long and the air grew colder. The trees whispered ominously in the wind, and every rustling leaf seemed to carry the weight of unseen eyes. Alden's grip on the reins tightened as a sense of foreboding crept over him. He cast frequent glances over his shoulder, his instincts honed by years of vigilance, warning him they were not alone. The boy finally spoke as they neared the outskirts of the village, his voice a fragile whisper. "My father, is he gone?" Alden hesitated, his throat tightening at the question. The boy's tone was not one of hope, but of dread, an understanding far too heavy for one so young. The blacksmith chose his words carefully, though the truth could not be softened. "I don't know," he replied, "but we'll keep you safe." The boy fell silent again, his small body sagging against Alden's chest as exhaustion overcame him. When they reached Alden Hollow, the village was cloaked in uneasy quiet. smoke curled from chimneys, but the streets were empty. The usual hum of evening activity replaced by an air of tension. Alden dismounted and hurried toward his forge, his movements brisk and deliberate. He would not risk being seen with the child until he understood the full extent of what he had stumbled upon. Inside the forge, the glow of embers cast flickering shadows across the walls. Alden laid the boy on a cot in a corner, covering him with a blanket. The child clung to the metal even in his sleep, his tiny fingers refusing to relinquish the only link to his past. For a moment, Alden simply stood there, staring down at the boy. He thought of his own daughter, how she had once clutched her favorite doll in a similar manner, as though it could shield her from the cruelties of the world. His chest tightened, the ache of loss resurfacing like an old wound reopened. A faint knock at the door pulled Alden from his thoughts. He crossed the room swiftly, opening the door just enough to peer outside. It was Elda, the village healer, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. Her gaze fell to the boy on the cot, and her expression shifted to one of alarm. "What have you done, Alden?" she hissed, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Do you know who that is?" Alden's jaw tightened. "I have an idea. He was left to die on the battlefield. What was I supposed to do, leave him there?" Elda shook her head, her hands gripping the edges of her worn cloak. "You're a fool if you think this ends with you bringing him here. That child is the last of the royal line. If Lord Draven's men find him, they'll burn this village to the ground." "I won't let that happen," Alden replied firmly, though the weight of Elda's words settled heavily on him. He had no plan, no idea how to protect the boy beyond keeping him hidden. Yet as he looked at the child, fragile but alive, he knew he could not turn away from this burden. Elda sighed, her sharp demeanor softening slightly. "You'll need my help if you're to keep him safe. But mark my words, Alden, this boy's survival could change the fate of the kingdom. If you fail, it won't just be your life on the line." Before Alden could respond, the sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. His blood ran cold. Someone was coming, someone who should not be here at this hour. He grabbed a dagger from his workbench and gestured for Elda to hide. As the boy stirred in his sleep, Alden positioned himself by the door, his heart pounding. The faint hope that the riders might pass through without stopping was dashed when the hooves came to a halt just outside. Voices murmured, low and threatening, followed by the sharp clang of metal against wood. Whoever they were, they had come for more than idle conversation. Alden glanced at the boy, then at Elda. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of his resolve. If they find him, everything is lost. The knock at the door came, louder and more insistent this time. Alden tightened his grip on the dagger, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The pounding at the door grew louder, shaking the wooden frame. Whoever stood outside wasn't going to wait for an invitation. Alden steadied his breathing, the cool hilt of the dagger firm in his grasp. He motioned for Elda to remain by the boy, her expression etched with fear and determination. The healer crouched beside the cot, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder, as though her mere presence could shield him. The voice that followed the knock was deep and commanding. "Open in the name of Lord Draven. We seek a fugitive. No harm will come to those who cooperate." Alden's jaw clenched. He had heard tales of Draven's enforcers, ruthless men who wielded loyalty like a blade. Their promises of mercy were as hollow as the battlefield graves they left behind. Yet he could not let panic cloud his judgment. He moved to the door, cracking it open just enough to peer outside. 3 men sat astride their horses, their armor dull but serviceable, marked with Draven's sigil, a snarling wolf. The leader dismounted, his face shadowed by a helmet, though his predatory smile was visible beneath the visor. His eyes scanned Alden with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to finding weakness. "We're searching for a child," the leader said, his tone almost conversational. "Royal blood. Small. Frightened. Surely a man of your station would have no reason to harbor such a dangerous fugitive." "I've seen no one," Alden replied evenly, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man used to working with fire. "Only the dead remain on the battlefield." The leader chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Is that so? Then you won't mind if we look around." Before Alden could respond, the leader pushed the door open wider, stepping inside. His boots echoed against the stone floor of the forge, and his men followed, their swords glinting faintly in the firelight. Alden stepped back, his grip tightening on the dagger hidden behind his back. He needed to keep them away from the boy, but how? "Not much of a smith, are you?" the leader sneered, glancing at the tools and half-finished weapons scattered about. "Doesn't seem like you've been busy forging swords for the usurper's cause." "I forge for whoever pays," Alden replied curtly. "Nothing more, nothing less." The leader's gaze lingered on Alden, as though weighing the truth of his words. Then, his attention shifted to a pile of burlap sacks in the corner, mere feet from where Elda and the boy were hidden. Alden's heart hammered in his chest as the man took a step closer. "I wouldn't bother with those," Alden said quickly, his voice sharp enough to draw the leader's attention. "Just scrap metal and rusted tools. Not worth your time." The leader paused, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully eager to protect your rubbish." "Only because I value my livelihood," Alden shot back. "A blacksmith's tools are his lifeblood." "You wouldn't understand." For a moment, the room was heavy with tension. Then the leader's lips curled into a smirk, and he stepped back. "Very well, we'll search the rest of the village. But if we find out you've lied," he left the threat hanging in the air, turning on his heel and motioning for his men to follow. The soldiers mounted their horses, their departure as abrupt as their arrival. Alden watched them disappear into the darkness, his muscles coiled like a spring until the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. Behind him, Elda emerged from the shadows, her face pale but resolute. "That was too close," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They'll be back." "You know they will. They can come as often as they like," Alden replied, his voice low and firm. "This boy doesn't leave my sight." Elda studied him, her sharp gaze softening with something akin to respect. "You're putting the entire village at risk." "I know," Alden admitted. "But what would you have me do? Hand him over to wolves like that? He's just a child." "A child who carries the weight of a kingdom," Elda countered. "You can't protect him alone." Alden turned to the cot where the boy lay, his small form dwarfed by the blanket. The child's breathing had evened out, but his grip on the royal metal remained tight, as though it were a lifeline. Alden knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's face. For the first time in years, the blacksmith felt a stirring in his chest, a sense of purpose beyond the forge, beyond survival. "I don't need to be alone," Alden said quietly, his gaze meeting Elda's. "You've already risked yourself by coming here. I'll need your help if I'm to keep him safe." Elda hesitated, the weight of his words evident. Then she nodded. "We'll need supplies. A plan. If they search the village thoroughly, it's only a matter of time before they find him." Alden rose, his jaw set. "Then we'll leave before they get the chance." "Leave?" Elda's eyes widened. "And go where?" "Somewhere they won't look," Alden replied. "The forests, the mountains, anywhere but here. I'll take him far from Draven's reach, even if it means never returning." The healer was silent for a moment, then placed a hand on his arm. "If you're serious about this, you'll need more than courage. You'll need allies." "I'll find them," Alden said, a spark of determination in his voice. "Whatever it takes." Elda nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "Then we leave at dawn. If this boy truly is the kingdom's last hope, we cannot afford to fail." As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Alden prepared to leave behind the only home he had ever known. The forge, once a place of comfort and purpose, now felt like a prison. He packed what little he could carry, his mind racing with the uncertainty of the road ahead. Yet for the first time in years, he felt alive, not as a blacksmith, but as a man with something worth fighting for. The first light of dawn bathed Alden Hollow in a pale, golden glow as Alden guided his mare through the back alleys of the village. The boy sat in front of him on the saddle, his small hands gripping the blacksmith's thick cloak. Elda followed closely on foot, her pack filled with herbs, bandages, and whatever food she could gather before their departure. The streets were eerily quiet, the villagers still locked in their homes, fearful of Draven's soldiers who had prowled the night before. Every sound seemed amplified. The soft clink of the horse's bridle, the rustle of Elda's cloak, the distant caw of a crow. Alden's senses were sharp, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner for signs of danger. He knew they were vulnerable, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Keep your head down," he murmured to the boy, whose piercing eyes peeked out from beneath the hood of a borrowed cloak. The child nodded silently, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. For someone so young, he bore his burden with a quiet strength that both impressed and unsettled Alden. They slipped out of the village unnoticed, taking a narrow path that wound through the forest. The trees towered above them, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the morning light into fractured beams. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. Alden urged the horse into a steady trot, his mind racing with thoughts of where to go, where to hide. "Do you have a destination in mind?" Elda asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but firm, a reflection of her unshakable resolve. "West," Alden replied, "toward the mountains. There are caves there, places no one would think to look." "The mountains are dangerous," Elda said. "Bandits, wild beasts. It's no place for a child." "It's no place for Draven's men either," Alden countered. "If we stay on the main roads, they'll catch us before nightfall. The mountains are our best chance." Elda didn't argue, though her expression remained tense. She glanced at the boy, who was staring intently at the metal in his hands. The emblem of the royal family seemed to glow faintly in the dappled sunlight, a symbol of hope and danger in equal measure. The morning passed in relative quiet, the trio moving steadily through the forest. They spoke little, their focus on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Alden Hollow. But as the sun climbed higher, the tension in the air grew heavier, an invisible weight pressing down on them. It was mid-afternoon when Alden's instincts flared. The forest had gone unnervingly silent, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. He pulled the horse to a halt, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of the short sword strapped to his saddle. "What is it?" Elda whispered, her voice tight. Alden scanned the trees, his eyes narrowing. "We're being watched." No sooner had the words left his mouth than an arrow whistled through the air, striking the ground inches from the horse's hooves. The mare reared, and Alden tightened his grip on the reins, his heart pounding. From the shadows emerged a group of figures, their faces obscured by crude masks. "Bandits." Well, one of them drawled, stepping forward with a swagger. He was a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do we have here?" "A blacksmith, a healer, and a little lordling playing at travelers." Alden dismounted slowly, placing himself between the bandits and the boy. "We have no quarrel with you," he said, his voice steady. "Let us pass, and there'll be no trouble." The bandit leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "No trouble? You're in our forest, friend. Everything that passes through here belongs to us. And I reckon that shiny metal of yours would fetch a fair price." "Over my dead body," Alden growled, his hand tightening on his sword. "That can be arranged," the leader sneered, drawing his own blade. The fight that followed was brutal and swift. Alden's movements were those of a seasoned warrior, his strikes precise and powerful. Elda stayed close to the boy, keeping him shielded as chaos erupted around them. The bandits were skilled, But they hadn't expected resistance from a blacksmith, and Alden's sheer determination turned the tide in their favor. But victory came at a cost. As the last bandit fell, Alden staggered back, blood seeping from a gash on his arm. Elda was at his side in an instant, her hands already pulling herbs and bandages from her pack. "Sit," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll bleed out if you don't let me tend to this." Alden gritted his teeth, but complied, his eyes never leaving the boy. The child was unharmed, though his face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the metal. Alden's heart ached at the sight. No child should have to witness such violence. "We can't stay here," Alden said through clenched teeth as Elda worked. "They'll have friends nearby." "I know," Elda replied, "but you won't make it far without rest." The boy stepped forward then, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't stop. They'll find us." Alden looked at him, startled by the conviction in his tone. There was something in the boy's eyes, an unyielding determination that belied his years. In that moment, Alden saw not just a frightened child, but a future leader, one who carried the weight of a kingdom on his small shoulders. "We'll keep moving," Alden said, his voice resolute. "But we'll take the hidden paths. No more roads, no more chances." Elda nodded, helping him to his feet. The boy handed Alden the medal, his small hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "This is ours to protect." Alden took it, the cool metal pressing into his palm. He felt the weight of the child's words, the silent oath they both seemed to take in that moment. Protecting this boy was no longer just about survival. It was about hope, hope for a future worth fighting for. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to close in around them. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they could no longer run. The time would come when they would have to stand and fight. The forest thickened as Alden, Elda, and the boy pressed on, its ancient trees rising like sentinels to block out the waning daylight. The narrow, overgrown paths they followed seemed forgotten by time, winding deeper into the wilderness where the air grew colder and the silence more oppressive. Alden's wound throbbed beneath the hastily wrapped bandage, but he pushed the pain aside, his focus fixed on finding a place to rest and regroup. The boy walked close beside him, his small steps quickened to match Alden's longer strides, while Elda trailed behind, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. It was the boy who first spotted the remnants of an old structure, barely visible through the undergrowth. "There," he whispered, pointing to the jagged outline of a stone archway hidden among the trees. Alden followed the boy's gaze, his brows furrowing. The ruins were ancient, their weathered stones covered in moss and vines. What had once been a small outpost or shrine was now little more than crumbling walls and half-buried foundations. Yet it offered the shelter they desperately needed. They entered cautiously, Alden leading the way, with his hand on the hilt of his sword. The air inside was damp and carried the faint scent of decay, but the walls, though broken in places, provided a sense of protection from the open forest. Elda set down her pack, her movements deliberate as she began to unpack their meager supplies. "This will have to do for now," she said, her voice low. "We can't risk lighting a fire, it would draw too much attention." Alden nodded, his attention drifting to the boy, who had seated himself on a flat stone near the center of the ruins. The child held the royal metal tightly, his fingers tracing its intricate design. There was a quiet intensity in his expression, as though he were lost in thought, or perhaps in memory. Alden crouched beside him, his voice soft but firm. "Do you know what this place is?" The boy shook his head, his eyes meeting Alden's. "No, but it feels familiar." "Many things will feel familiar to you," Elda said, joining them. She knelt, her tone gentler than usual. "Your lineage ties you to places like this. Shrines, fortresses, castles. They're all part of the kingdom you'll one day inherit. But only if you survive." The boy looked down at the metal in his hands. "If the kingdom is mine, why does it feel like I've already lost it?" Alden exchanged a glance with Elda, his chest tightening at the boy's words. For all his composure, the child was still just that, a child, thrust into a world of danger and responsibility far beyond his years. "You haven't lost it," Alden said, his voice steady. "As long as you're alive, there's hope. But hope is something we'll have to fight for." The boy nodded, though his grip on the metal remained firm. Elda stood, her gaze sweeping the ruins. "We should get some rest," she said. "We'll need our strength for whatever lies ahead." Alden agreed, though his instincts refused to let him relax. He positioned himself near the entrance, his sword resting across his lap as he kept watch. The forest beyond the walls was unervingly still, as though holding its breath, and every rustle of leaves sent a prickle of unease down his spine. The hours passed slowly. Elda dozed lightly against the wall, her pack serving as a makeshift pillow, while the boy curled up on the stone, the metal still clutched in his hands. Alden remained awake, his eyes fixed on the dark expanse of trees beyond the ruined archway. His thoughts churned, a mix of worry and determination. The boy's safety had become his singular purpose, but the weight of that responsibility was immense. His vigilance was rewarded, or cursed, when he heard it, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable. The snap of a twig, the rustle of movement through the underbrush. Alden's hand tightened on his sword, his muscles tensing as he strained to pinpoint the source. "Elda," he whispered sharply. The healer stirred, her eyes snapping open at the urgency in his tone. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We're not alone." Elda rose silently, her movements careful as she positioned herself near the boy. The child stirred but didn't wake, his small body shifting slightly as Elda placed a protective hand on his shoulder. Alden stood, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the archway. The sounds grew closer, soft, deliberate steps, as though whoever or whatever was approaching knew exactly what it was doing. He adjusted his grip on the sword, his pulse steady but rapid. The figure that emerged from the forest was cloaked, its face obscured by the deep hood. Alden raised his blade, his voice low and firm. "Stop where you are." The figure obeyed, lifting its hands slowly to show they were empty. "I mean no harm," a voice said, deep and gravelly, but not unkind. The hood was lowered to reveal a man of middle age, his weathered face framed by streaks of gray in his dark hair. His eyes, sharp and searching, met Alden's without fear. "Who are you?" Alden demanded. "A friend," the man replied. "Or an enemy, depending on what you seek." "We seek safety," Elda interjected, stepping forward but keeping the boy behind her. "Nothing more." The man's gaze shifted to her, then to the boy, lingering for a moment before returning to Alden. "Then you found it. This place is known to few, and fewer still dare to come here. You're either very brave or very desperate." "Both," Alden said curtly. "What do you want?" "I want to help," the man said simply. "But first I need to know if you're worth helping." Alden's grip on his sword didn't waver, but something in the man's tone gave him pause. There was no malice in his words, only a quiet conviction that hinted at experience, and perhaps an understanding of their plight. "And how will you determine that?" Alden asked. The man smiled faintly. "That depends. Are you willing to trust me?" Alden didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Elda, whose expression mirrored his own hesitation. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, yet the man's presence and his knowledge of the ruins suggested he might be more than he seemed. After a long moment, Alden lowered his sword slightly. "You found us, which means others might too. If you truly mean to help, then prove it." The man nodded, his expression serious. "I will, but not tonight. Rest while you can. Tomorrow, the real journey begins." As he stepped back into the shadows, Alden couldn't shake the feeling that their fates had just taken another unexpected turn. He sat beside the boy, his mind racing with questions and doubts. The forest around them remained still, but Alden knew their respite would be brief. The real test lay ahead, and it would demand more than strength or resolve. It would demand trust, something Alden had thought himself incapable of. The dawn came cloaked in mist, shrouding the ruins in an ethereal haze. Alden was the first to wake, the weight of unease dragging him from a restless sleep. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like the embers of a dying fire, their glow faint but insistent. He glanced at the boy, still curled up on the stone, and Elda, her head resting against the mossy wall. The mysterious man had disappeared into the forest during the night, leaving behind only more questions. As the group prepared to move, Alden sensed the air had changed. The forest, once an ally, now seemed to conspire against them. The sounds of wildlife were muted, and even the rustling leaves seemed to carry a warning. The boy noticed it too, his small hand gripping Alden's sleeve as they packed their belongings. "We're not safe here, are we?" the child asked softly, his voice steady despite his youth. "No," Alden admitted, his tone firm but reassuring. "But we will be, I promise you." The group set out westward, their pace quickened by the growing tension. The forest paths were treacherous, winding through dense underbrush and across streams that threatened to pull them off course. Elda kept to the rear, her sharp eyes scanning for danger, while Alden led the way, the boy never straying far from his side. By mid-morning, the sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the fragile silence. Alden froze, his hand immediately going to his sword. The boy's eyes widened, and Elda's face hardened as she reached for the small dagger tucked into her belt. "They've found us," Elda said, her voice low and grim. Alden's mind raced. They were too far from the mountains to reach safety, and the open forest offered little cover. He glanced around, his gaze landing on a narrow ravine hidden by thick undergrowth. It was a gamble, but it was the only option. "This way," he said, motioning for the others to follow. They slid down the embankment, their movements quick but careful. The ravine was shallow, its rocky floor slick with moss, but it offered a temporary reprieve from the open forest. Alden positioned himself at the edge, his sword drawn, while Elda and the boy huddled in the shadows below. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the guttural shouts of men. Alden's grip tightened on his weapon, his body coiled like a spring. He could see them now, Draven's soldiers, a dozen or more, their armor glinting faintly in the dappled sunlight. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel scar bisecting his face, raised a hand, signaling for the group to halt. "They're close," the leader growled, his voice carrying through the trees. "Spread out. Leave no stone unturned." Alden's pulse quickened. He could feel the boy's fear radiating from the shadows, but the child remained silent, his small frame pressed against Elda's side. The healer placed a protective arm around him, her expression fierce. The soldiers began to fan out, their boots crunching against the forest floor. Alden knew it was only a matter of time before they reached the ravine. His mind raced, searching for a way to delay them, to buy even a few precious moments. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The cloaked man had returned, emerging from the opposite side of the ravine. The man moved with a confidence that defied the tension of the moment. He stepped into the soldier's path, his hands raised in what seemed to be a gesture of surrender. The leader turned, his expression darkening. "And who might you be?" the scarred man demanded. "A traveler," the cloaked man replied evenly. "Lost and looking for the nearest village." "I mean no harm." The leader's eyes narrowed, suspicion evident. "You've chosen a poor time to get lost, friend. We're hunting a fugitive. Perhaps you've seen him?" The cloaked man tilted his head, as though considering the question. "I may have," he said slowly, "but you'll have to catch me to find out." Before the soldiers could react, the man turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. The leader cursed loudly, motioning for half the group to follow. The remaining soldiers hesitated, clearly torn between orders and their original mission. Alden seized the opportunity. He climbed back up the embankment, his movements swift and silent, and took out the nearest soldier with a well-placed strike. The man crumpled without a sound, his body slumping to the ground. Alden signaled to Elda, who ushered the boy deeper into the ravine. The remaining soldiers, now alert to the danger, turned their attention to Alden. He met them head-on, his sword flashing in the muted light. The fight was brutal, the clash of steel against steel echoing through the trees. Alden's skill and determination were unmatched, but the odds were against him. Elda, unwilling to remain idle, emerged from the shadows, her dagger slicing through the air with deadly precision. Together, they fought as a unit, their movements coordinated and efficient. The boy watched from his hiding place, his small hands clenched into fists. Though fear clouded his young face, there was also a spark of something deeper, determination. The battle reached its peak when the scarred leader returned, his face twisted with rage. He charged at Alden, his massive blade swinging with relentless force. Alden met him blow for blow, the clash of their weapons reverberating through the ravine. It was a test of strength and will, and Alden knew he could not afford to lose. The leader's arrogance proved his undoing. As he raised his sword for a final strike, Alden sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him. The leader stumbled, and Alden drove his blade into the man's side. The scarred man fell with a guttural cry, his weapon clattering to the ground. The remaining soldiers, seeing their leader defeated, fled into the forest, their courage shattered. Alden sank to his knees, his breath ragged, as Elda rushed to his side. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with worry. "It's nothing," Alden replied, though his body told a different story. He glanced at the boy, who emerged cautiously from the shadows. The child's eyes met Alden's, and for the first time, the boy spoke with quiet certainty. "We can't run forever." Alden nodded, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "No, we can't. But we bought ourselves time. And sometimes, time is all we need." The boy held out the royal medal, his small hand steady. "This isn't just mine to carry. It's ours." Alden took the medal, its weight heavier than he remembered. He looked at the boy, seeing not just a child, but the beginnings of a leader. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The forest stood still, heavy with the silence that often followed chaos. The scarred leader's body lay motionless where it had fallen, and the faint sounds of retreating soldiers faded into the distance. Alden leaned heavily against a tree, his breathing labored, his arms slick with blood from a wound that refused to be ignored. The boy knelt beside him, his small hands trembling as they pressed a torn piece of cloth to the injury, trying to stem the flow. Elda crouched at Alden's other side, her sharp eyes scanning the wound with a grim determination. "You've pushed yourself too far," she said, her voice tight. "You'll bleed out if we don't stop this." "We don't have time," Alden replied, his tone firm despite the weakness creeping into it. His gaze shifted to the boy, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. "They'll regroup. We need to keep moving. You can't protect him if you're dead," Elda snapped, her hands already working to apply a poultice to the wound. Her touch was swift but careful, a practiced blend of precision and urgency. "If you want to give him a chance, you need to survive this." The boy's voice broke through the tension, soft but resolute. "I'll help you." Alden looked at him, surprised by the quiet strength in his words. The child's face was pale, his expression torn between fear and determination, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. He was no longer the trembling figure Alden had carried from the battlefield. He was changing, growing under the weight of their shared burden. "You've done enough already," Alden said gently. "Leave this to us." The boy shook his head. "I'm not just a child. I'm the heir to this kingdom. I have to learn how to fight for it." Elda glanced at Alden, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "He's right. We can't shield him forever." Alden sighed, the weight of their words settling heavily on him. He reached out, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Fighting isn't just about swords and battles. It's about knowing when to stand and when to retreat. Right now we need to keep you alive. The boy hesitated, then nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. They rested briefly, long enough for Elda to stabilize Alden's wound and gather their dwindling supplies. The cloaked man returned, his expression grim but calm, and led them deeper into the forest. He spoke little, his presence more shadow than a companion, but his knowledge of the terrain was invaluable. The paths he chose were hidden, weaving through dense underbrush and rocky outcrops that shielded them from prying eyes. By nightfall, they reached a small clearing at the base of the mountains. The air was thinner here, cooler, and the stars above seemed brighter against the inky sky. The cloaked man motioned for them to stop, his voice low but firm. This is as far as I can take you. Beyond this point, the mountains are your only refuge. Why? Elda asked, her tone sharp. Why can't you come with us? The man's gaze settled on the boy, his expression unreadable. Because my fight lies elsewhere. You'll need allies where you're going, and I'll find them. Alden studied the man, his instincts warring with his need for trust. Finally, he nodded. If you truly mean to help, then find them quickly. We don't have much time. The man inclined his head, then turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving them alone in the clearing. Alden's exhaustion was palpable, but his focus remained sharp. He guided the boy to a sheltered spot near the edge of the clearing, his voice soft as he spoke. You're stronger than you know, he said, his gaze meeting the boy's. But strength isn't just about courage. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. The boy nodded, his small hands gripping the royal metal tightly. I'll make you proud. Alden smiled faintly, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. You already have. The moment was interrupted by a sound that froze them all. The unmistakable snap of a branch, followed by the low murmur of voices. Alden rose, his sword in hand, his body tense despite the pain that lanced through him. Elda pulled the boy close, her dagger ready. From the shadows emerged a group of soldiers, their torches casting flickering light across the clearing. Their leader, clad in dark armor that seemed to drink in the firelight, stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. You've led us on quite the chase, he said, his voice a sinister blend of mockery and menace. But it ends here. Alden stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the torchlight. You'll have to go through me. The leader smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. The battle that followed was fierce and unrelenting. Alden fought with every ounce of strength he had left, his strikes fueled by a desperate need to protect the boy. Elda joined the fray, her movements quick and precise as she defended the child. But the soldiers were numerous, and the odds were grim. When the leader advanced on the boy, Alden saw his chance. With a roar, he threw himself between them, his sword clashing against the soldier's blade. The pain in his body was blinding, but he fought on, his determination unyielding. In the final moments, Alden made his choice. With a surge of strength, he drove his blade into the leader's chest, but not before the soldier's weapon found its mark. Alden fell to his knees, blood staining the ground beneath him. The leader's body crumpled, and the remaining soldiers fled, their morale shattered. Elda rushed to Alden's side, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding. But he knew it was too late. His gaze found the boy, who knelt before him, tears streaming down his face. You'll lead them, Alden said, his voice weak but resolute. Not with fear, but with hope. That's how you'll save this kingdom. The boy clutched Alden's hand, his small fingers trembling. I won't let you down. Alden smiled faintly, his eyes closing as the weight of his sacrifice settled over him. I know. The forest grew silent once more, and the stars above seemed to burn brighter, as though honoring the man who had given everything for a boy who carried the future. Years passed, and the kingdom began to heal. The rebellion led by Lord Draven was crushed, his forces scattered to the winds. But the cost had been steep. The lands once fractured by war and betrayal now bore the scars of their struggle. But amid the ruins, hope flourished anew. In the heart of the capital, the grand hall of the castle brimmed with life. Tapestries depicting the kingdom's victories hung from the walls, and the sounds of music and laughter filled the air as courtiers and common folk gathered for the coronation of their new king. The boy who had once been found on a battlefield, frightened and alone, now stood on the cusp of his destiny. Dressed in regal finery, he approached the dais with a steady stride. The boy, now a young man, had grown into a figure of quiet strength. His eyes, once wide with fear, now shone with determination, tempered by the wisdom of his trials. In his hand, he carried the royal medal, its once faded surface polished to a gleaming shine. It had become a symbol not just of his lineage, but of the sacrifices that had brought him to this moment. The high priest stepped forward, the crown of the kingdom resting in his hands. The crowd fell silent as the young man knelt, his head bowed in reverence. As the crown was placed upon his head, a cheer erupted, reverberating through the hall and beyond. The people chanted his name, their voices filled with hope for a new era. When the ceremony ended, the new king did not retreat to the solitude of the throne. Instead, he walked among the people, shaking hands and listening to their words. He remembered the lessons Alden had taught him, that a true leader served not out of ambition, but out of duty to those who depended on him. His gaze often strayed to the seat of honor near the dais, where a sword and a blacksmith's apron were displayed. They were Alden's, preserved as a tribute to the man who had given everything so that this day might come. Later that evening, the young king retreated to the castle gardens, seeking a moment of solitude beneath the stars. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers mingling with the faint hum of the festivities still echoing from the hall. He carried the medal in his hand, turning it over as he often did when lost in thought. "You'd have laughed at all this," he murmured, his voice carrying a hint of a smile. "Alden the blacksmith, revered as a hero. But they were right to honor you. Without you, none of this would have been possible." His words were met with silence, but he felt the presence of his mentor as surely as if the man stood beside him. The lessons Alden had imparted, the strength of humility, the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves, guided him still. They were the foundation upon which he would build his reign. The sound of footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to find Elda approaching. The years had softened her sharp edges, though her eyes remained as keen as ever. She bowed slightly, a gesture more of respect than formality. "The people adore you," she said. "You've done well. I had good teachers," the king replied, his gaze returning to the sky. "And good allies." Elda joined him in silence, her hands clasped before her. "You've honored Alden's memory," she said after a moment, "more than he could have ever imagined." The king's grip on the medal tightened. "I wish he could see this." "He does," Elda replied softly. "In every act of kindness, every choice you make to better this kingdom, he sees it." The king nodded, his resolve hardening. "This kingdom has suffered enough. I'll see to it that his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Elda smiled faintly, her expression one of both pride and sorrow. "Then you'll be the king we always knew you could be." As the night deepened, the young king stood alone beneath the stars, the medal gleaming faintly in his hand. His thoughts turned to the journey that had brought him here, the fear and uncertainty of the battlefield, the warmth and strength of Alden's guidance, the sacrifices that had paved the way for his ascension. He carried those memories with him, not as a burden, but as a beacon. The kingdom had been given a second chance, and he would not squander it. With each passing day, he vowed to honor Alden's legacy, not just as a king, but as a man who understood the true meaning of leadership. As the stars above seemed to shine brighter, he felt the weight of the crown on his head, not as a chain, but as a reminder of the hope entrusted to him. And so, under the vast expanse of the night sky, The boy who had been saved by a blacksmith began his reign as a king determined to forge a brighter future, one act of courage and compassion at a time.